Record. All right, fire away.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to get started in just a minute. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for being here at the second event of our 2025 Municipalism Learning Series. My name is Arthur. I use he, him pronouns. I'm based here in Seattle, and I am one of the co-directors of the Municipalism Learning Series, which of course is a part of the Solidarity Research Center. So we're really excited to have you all here for today's event. It's a special event on the topic of base building. What is base building? We're going to get into that in a minute, but this is going to be a really precious opportunity to kind of really dig into the nitty-gritty details of community organizing. What does it mean to build power concretely in your community? But before we get started, just for some logistics, want to let people know we're planning on having a 90-minute event here. It's gonna be a conversation about our various experiences organizing in our communities. We have 3 very special guests to share their experiences. And we're gonna be recording the event here as well. So after having kind of lightly facilitated conversation, we're gonna turn things over and welcome attendees, participants to share some questions that may come up over the course of the event. And hopefully you'll have the chance to share your questions with speakers and kind of bring you all into a wider circle of conversation. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the Municipalism Learning Series as a whole. And really what this is a popular education program. We are trying to put kind of the theoretical and practical tools in people's hands to encourage them, teach them, empower them to get out in their communities and get organized, really strive for self-governance at the level of the local community. And that can look a myriad of different ways, as we'll get into today. But what that really comes down to is what we call building power in place. So if you're not familiar with SRC's Building Power in Place Municipalist Organizing Toolkit, highly encourage folks to check that out. We'll share some links in the chat. And some of our panelists today even help contribute to the content of that toolkit itself. The other thing I want to let people know for context is that this is a whole series about building power in place. It's not just a one-off event. So last January, we had an event on the topic of community defense, which is a very timely conversation. And another link we'll be sharing is that of a recording of that conversation. So encourage people to check that out. And furthermore, this is not going to be the last event in the series. We're going to have 2 more after this. The next one being on September 9th on the topic of direct democracy and popular assemblies. We're very excited to have Rosie DeSantis, community organizer from Detroit, as well as Denzel from the Black Nashville Assembly to share their experiences specifically on building structures of direct democracy. And then later on, the end of the year, we're going to have an event on building long-term municipalist strategies for dual power. But anyway, let's get to the topic of today's event here, which is base building. What do we mean by base building? I'll let the panelists define it for themselves, but just the most general sort of description of what we mean here, we're talking about widening the circle of participation and leadership in our organizing spheres in our communities, right? So as opposed to a strictly activist approach, where maybe those of us who want to go make a change happen in society, we get a small group of people together, some compelling messaging, we go out, we try to make a splash in the media or carry out a disruptive action. And that's not to belittle these things. It's important to mobilize. But what we're talking about here today, especially with base building, is what is the difference between something that's purely activism and what we would consider meaningfully organizing, grassroots organizing, bringing everyday people together where they are and empowering them to really transform the conditions of their own lives through their own self-organization. So without further ado, I want to introduce our panelists. We're very excited to have here today, first of all, Kamau Franklin. Kamau is a longtime community organizer and the founder of Community Movement Builders, a grassroots organization dedicated to building power in working class and Black communities. By resisting gentrification, police violence, and food insecurity, Community Movement Builders works to advance a long-term strategy for self-determination that is rooted in place and guided by a sweeping vision of liberated zones, communities where local people have direct control over their own political and economic institutions. We also have Belinda Rodriguez with us today. Belinda is a longtime community organizer, trainer, facilitator, and co-founder of Momentum, a social movement institute providing innovative models for decentralized campaigns. A Cuban American originally from Miami, she currently lives in Baltimore, where she organizes with Housing Our Neighbors, a grassroots community organization fighting for housing justice. Belinda is also a member of the Solidarity Research Center and associate editor of our Municipalist Organizing Toolkit. And lastly, we also have Maria Fernanda Cabello, who we call Mafe, and we're stoked to have Mafe here. We really were impressed by a recent workshop which she gave about base building, and we thought we had our roster all together, and we realized it was incomplete without her. So Mafe is a training director of the Build the Base program at Rutgers University, which is a part of their Workplace Justice Lab. So in this role, she helps worker centers and economic justice organizations to recruit and involve their core constituencies to build the capacity to act for themselves. Mafe is an immigrant from Mexico and a community organizer with 15 years of experience driving campaigns and initiatives focused on racial, economic, and environmental justice, as well as immigrant rights and civic participation. Her expertise spans from developing national training strategies and mobilizing communities of color to get vaccinated against COVID-19, to her role at Momentum, coaching activists to build powerful campaigns for social justice. Mafe is also co-founder of Movimiento Cosecha, a nonviolent popular movement aimed at securing permanent protection, dignity, and respect for all immigrants. So I want to thank you all so much for being a part of today's conversation. And I'd love to just jump right into it. With the first question, we can just start going around, and we can start with you, Kamau. What does base building mean to you, and why does it matter?
I think part of your intro, summed it up quite nicely. For me, base building is specifically for us, community organizing at the level of non-organizer activists and/or the role of the organizer activists is to get folks who are not necessarily people who describe themselves that way, not people who are necessarily overtly politicized, involved in political action and or organizing. And I think, for organizations or whatever, it depends on what your constituency is, right? There's organizations that do this with workers. There's organizations like ours that do this in community. There's transit rider organizations, obviously, so on and so forth. So organizations, and I believe in organizations, pick constituencies or areas of work. And it's through those areas of work that people define where they want to base build. And then again, the purpose of the base building for me is to not only to, well, very important, I shouldn't say not only, it is to politicize people about their power, about their role in society, about their circumstances. A lot of times, of course, people already know this, and they just want support in trying to make this happen or feel connected to folks who can come in and try to make some of this happen. And it's a fight for power, right? And power can be decided on in a couple of ways, as far as I'm concerned. Obviously, campaign organizing, fighting to change policy. I think that is a form of fighting for power, fighting to control neighborhood structures. In our case, in terms of liberated territory, that means for us, what structures do we control in the community? What have we built out of those structures? Do we have education structures? Do we do town halls or other mechanisms to bring people together, like assemblies, so that folks can gather together and talk about what a fight for power looks like? Are there other structures that we need to build and keep a hold on so that there can be real community power centered in a particular place? I will say lastly that I think base building, community organizing, base building, I say, is the toughest type of organizing, right? Because as you stated before, it is not just, and I don't underplay this because I think it's extremely important, the layer of organizer and activist that is already politicized, who once wasn't politicized. So we can't act as if these people came to a particular place already formed, but folks who have already politicized themselves. Those folks are charged with, right? The organizer, the revolutionary in radical struggles. How do they move people? And I think particularly in the context of the United States, that is extremely hard to do because there are so many distractions. There's so many ways in which the left is belittled. There's so many ways in which people are trying to survive their daily lives. And we've reached we might be coming to another kind of period, but we reached a period where mobilizations, we've seen that we can help support and build out mobilizations. One of the things I think, particularly on the left, I would say, is that we need to work harder on, or it's not proven to be our strength, is base building non-politicized people to actually be politicized and be a part of larger formations. I think right-wing people have developed that technique better. There might be certain advantages they have, like in terms of institutions and resources and the rest of it. But I think it is not only the hardest type of organizing to do, I think it is actually the most important type of organizing to do. Because without that layer of either community support or worker support, our larger goals and missions to transform society, or i.e. have a revolution, will never happen. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Kamau. Let's turn it over to Belinda. What are your thoughts? How you define base building and why does it matter to you?
Awesome, thank you. So a lot of similarities. To me, base building means organizing a specific constituency to participate in directly addressing their own needs. And I think this can take many forms. So it could mean getting people to organize on issues that impact them, or doing mutual aid work to increase access to food and other necessities, or just creating space for people to build like a sense of connectedness and solidarity with each other. Like we often think of, the issue campaigning as like, oh yeah, that's meeting people's needs. But I really do think those needs to feel connected and to exercise agency as part of a collective are also very, very real needs that can be met through base building and are not often very well met through some of the more issue-based nonprofit activisty kind of organizing that's dominated a lot of organizing over the past few decades. And this work matters to me because I think it's absolutely necessary if we're going to build the power that we need to take control of resources in our communities. And I also think that we need it so that we can take care of each other and get through the crises that we're experiencing together. We're just witnessing extremely horrific dehumanization and violence every day. And I don't think it's healthy for anyone to experience that alone. And when you're connected to people in your community who can acknowledge, what's going on in an honest and vulnerable way, and who are committed to, at least trying to do something about it and support each other through it, I think that really, really makes a difference. Like, it's not going to prevent you from feeling despair once in a while or feeling sad, but at least maybe you don't feel totally isolated, or like, you're alone with your thoughts and blaming yourself, or even like, judging other people. Like, all of those things are just so toxic. And when we can actually be connected to each other and go through it together, we give ourselves another option that helps us kind of hold on to our humanity and our dignity in this situation. And that's been hugely important for me. And honestly, I've been also using it like as a tool to like motivate people to get more involved in groups. Like there's a bunch of people at my gym who like were federal workers that were fired, and I've just been affirming like, wow, that's really hard. Like have you connected to fund? Like you shouldn't have to go through this alone. And that has really resonated with them, you know, because they're facing all this pressure of people telling them like your role is to just hold on to your job for life. And like that sucks, you know? Like no one should have to go through that alone. Um, but the other thing that I think makes base building really important is that it's a way of organizing that ensures that we're actually in charge of our own strategy, and that challenges us to create long-term strategy, which is something that we've really lost, in my opinion, with the dominance of a lot of foundation-funded organizing. When we're constantly trying to raise money, this is just like an ongoing distraction that's preventing us from setting long-term strategy, and it can also impact our priorities and kind of like shape them into something that's maybe not what we would decide, you know, left to our own devices, because we're trying to appeal to these funders. And I think prioritizing base building is a really powerful tool to help correct this issue, because it challenges us to be accountable to our base and craft strategy that actually resonates, that actually meets their needs. Because if we don't do that, like they're just going to lose interest. Like it literally just won't work. It's truly organizing that's incompatible with, you know, not having control of your own strategy. And I think that makes it really powerful, a really powerful antidote to this challenge.
Thank you so much, Belinda. Mafe, what do you think about base building? What does it mean to you? Why is it so important?
Yeah, I agree with everything Kamau and Belinda have said. And Kamau, I loved your like sharp like description of base building. What I was bringing in, like to me, that base building means people power, and it means believing in it and focusing on it. I think any organization, I think we ask, like they will say they believe in people power, but I think I've seen the prioritization of other strategies over actually base build. So we like to say at the Workplace Justice Lab that base building is like the aquifer of an organization, which, you know, aquifer is like the underground water that usually, I don't know if all, yeah, the underground water that we pull into our cities to get what we need. And so, like that is kind of what base building is. Like it's sometimes it seems hidden because a lot of the things that happen are one-on-one levels, or they're not the sexy, flashy thing that's going to make it in the media, that's going to then help us bring money. But it's the thing that feeds everything we do. And why it matters to me is because I want to win. Like I also think like base building is the strategy that needs lots and lots of practice. And I think Kamau, you said, and it's really, really hard to do. And um, there's lots of trial and error that usually involve like very personal, like, you know, you're developing people that you learn to love and care about. And I think that makes it harder, or it's a different muscle than like I'm trying to develop the right script versus I tried my best at developing this leader and we lost this campaign together. So like, what do we do next? So I think it's important to me because it's a strategy that takes a lot of work and a lot of effort, and we need to be able to support one another through this work. But at the end of the day, I think it's a strategy that's going to help us win. Because like Belinda said, like funders are very unreliable right now. And there's lots of things that are up in the air. But I think the thing that we can focus on is that the thing that moves people into action is like our stories and our community with one another. And so to me, base building is the strategy that helps us win.
Thank you all so much. I got no notes. It's a beautiful description of base building by organizers on the front lines of doing the work themselves. So I think maybe instead of staying here, we can keep this conversation going and dig a little deeper. What I'd like to ask you all next is to share a bit about your own organizing, your own communities that you're coming from. And I'm particularly interested, I think many people will be, to hear kind of lessons that you've learned along the way through your experience organizing in your own communities, especially thinking about challenges that you've faced and the ways that you try to overcome them. So let's go ahead and start with Kamau. Maybe you can tell us about the work that Community Movement Builders has been doing.
Sure. So Community Movement Builders is a national organization with 9 chapters across the country. Our founding chapter was started in Atlanta. As you read briefly in the description, we are basically an organizing outfit. We are a group that believes on the ground in community organizing. We get our lessons from the history of Black organizing, i.e. the UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association, the Nation of Islam, the Black Panther Party, even SNCC in terms of their freedom programs. We get our history from organizations that have done well in Black communities by being base builders in communities. Their first priorities was not downtown policies, although again, like you said, these are the things that may have gotten attention, but it was how do they build community with people who are not used to fighting anymore for their human rights or fighting for power. And we think the strategies that have been laid out in the past that have been the most successful are the ones that the government has most turned on to destroy. So, i.e., radical Black organizing that gets to the root of what the issues are, organizing that talks about capitalism, organizing that talks about white supremacy. And so we do a whole bunch of different things throughout the country, but again, it's important to state that we are rooted in Black communities. I'll use the Atlanta as a prime example. It's probably our more built out chapter. In Atlanta, we work all across the city, but our primary base is in Southwest Atlanta in a community called Pittsburgh, which is a working class poor Black community founded in 1883 by formerly enslaved Africans. We've been in the community for approximately 8 to 10 years. We currently own 4 houses in the community in which we do a program called workforce housing. So for organizers who either join or are part of the organization in exchange for cheap rent, they live in one of those houses. We actually have, 2 people per house, so a minimum of 8 people who live in the houses. And again, in exchange for cheap rent, they develop and give time towards community organizing and base building, which again means doing town halls, doing surveys, trying to figure out what the needs are, doing assemblies. We had one of our major goals, which we did fail at, was to take over the neighborhood association in order to fight against gentrification. People don't like when I say take over, but we were really trying to take it over. So, but that was because as long as we've been in the neighborhood, there were other folks who've been in the neighborhood longer who, as much as we like to believe, again, that people are waiting for us to come in and save them, there are people who have their own ideas around what community means for them. And some of the ideas aren't bad, but some of the ideas are corrupted, in my opinion, right? The ideas of selling your property at its highest value, or not caring about the idea of high rents and the turnover rate, or not thinking you could do anything about it, or again, within the community amongst organizers, and I guess more than just organizers, but there's a high degree of us having a sophistication about the role of police, but there's also people in the community who want the police, right? And our role is to have those struggles with them. So I say that all to say, in terms of some experiences, I'll turn to those really quickly. The experience, I've been a community organizer for 30 some odd years. I've organized in Brooklyn, where I'm from, Jackson, Mississippi, and something called the Jackson Plan, where we helped get the first Black sheriff elected in Hinds County. That turned out to be a mistake. There's a lot of lessons to learn there. And we later got someone elected to mayor, and I was his first campaign manager. And so we did some semblance of correct base building, but we also failed in long-term base building. And I think somebody mentioned trial and error, the things that I think, again, that we all need to continue to struggle around is the longevity of our work and projects. Folks mentioned the nonprofit industrial complex. We get, we have a nonprofit, we get money from that kind of stuff, but I completely agree is that the resources that you get don't always help you to do as much organizing as you thought it would. Sometimes it's a distraction from organizing, or sometimes it becomes something in which people, even the people you're organizing, start looking at you as a place for resources, as a place to organize with. So there's a very fine line between the resources that we can give to community and participate with community, that actually activates people to be involved in community, and something where folks themselves just they don't know you, they don't trust you. They've seen this game before where organizations have come into their neighborhoods and community and said, oh, we're here to do ABC, and 6 months later, a year later, 2 years later, those organizations evaporate and the people are still there. So part of base building, and I really do think not only in terms of, I want to bring in revolutionary struggles here. We can learn a lot from the revolutionary struggles around the world, whether or not that's been in Latin America, whether or not it's recently the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Ho Chi Minh City, formerly known as Saigon, looking at what organizers, the Chinese Revolution, the Russian Revolution, looking at what organizers, being a sick, I'm going to start naming places, so I'm going to stop. I was trying to make sure I got every continent. So making sure that organizers know the history of organizing, particularly around revolutionary struggle, and how those folks organized. Again, our situations may not be completely the same, but the overlapping conditions are the same. The causes are the same. And we diminish our ability to organize people when we move away from, in my humble opinion, left ideas around how to organize. And then we become these middle ground organizers who don't actually do anything different from what these folks have seen before. And so I think we need to captivate people, organize people, learn base building, understand the mistakes that will be made, and there will be plenty, but we need to hold it together and pick ourselves up and continue to do the work. I'll stop there.
Amazing. Amazing. So many valuable lessons. Let's keep it going. Belinda, what would you like to share about your own experiences and lessons learned?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so I organize with Housing Our Neighbors. We're a homeless advocacy group in Baltimore. We're made up of Baltimore residents who have the lived experience of homelessness, either in the past or in the present, and residents who are allies who want to fight for housing as a human right. And I make this distinction between our lived experience members and our allies, but I also want to clarify that when we're doing our organizing, we're doing it with the understanding that ending homelessness is really in our best interests and really in the best interests of everyone who's not profiting off of people's precarity in our current society. And like right now, a majority of people in the United States are living paycheck to paycheck. So that means that if you lose your job or have some kind of emergency, like you might not be able to afford rent or mortgage, and that's really most of us. So I just want to clarify, like this, we view this as like this is everyone's issue. Like this applies to all of us. And I really love our focus on ending homelessness, specifically thinking of like this dynamic where you're base building and you're trying to politicize people, because it sets this baseline of like this really radical goal to move towards that. It's just so obviously like homelessness is just so obviously like this totally inhumane like product of capitalism, of all of these different systems that we're swimming in. Right. And in order to end homelessness, you kind of have to address a lot of them. So by centering ending homelessness, we really can't do that without being multiracial, pro-trans, pro-immigrant by default. And it really strikes me that that reflects in our members with lived experience. Like this is very obvious to them. Like I remember hearing a story of a man saying that he was waiting in line to get into a shelter and someone who was trans was turned away. And he got so pissed off, he was just like, I'm not staying there either, just in solidarity. And this guy like actually needed a place to sleep tonight. So to sleep that night. So things like that really inspire me, that just, by default, there's like all of this inclusivity built into it and all this like radical vision built into this focus, even though in practice, like a lot of our members' politics honestly might be all over the place, but we can still be on the same page about like, we need to end homelessness. And I'm like, cool, that's great. Like I can work with this. So when I got involved in 2023, and at that time, the organization was at a very low point in terms of capacity. It was like after the pandemic, and we also lost one of our key leaders, Anthony Williams. So that was like a really big blow to the organization and to a lot of us personally. But the organization also had a very rich history of over 10 years of like very impactful and very inspiring organizing. So there was, you know, stuff to hold on to there. And most of the lessons that I've learned from Hun were like, how do you go about reviving an existing organization like that has history, but maybe, you know, is in a rut, and doing that in a way that honors the character and strengths of the organization while also like critically examining like what wasn't working well and what actually has to change. And for me personally, coming from a momentum background, it was very interesting because in momentum, there's this big emphasis on front loading, which is this idea that every organization or movement has a DNA that includes a story, a strategy, a structure, and a culture. And once it's set, it's very difficult to change. And what I learned from this experience with Hun is that that's not necessarily true. Like we were able to make significant changes to our structure and even our culture of how we share work. And we're also continuing to make those changes as we grow and evolve. So that was like kind of personally very interesting to me. And in terms of like how we shifted the structure, I think it started with really trying to reflect on like, you know, in this 10-year history, like what were the things that, you know, made the organizing work and what wasn't very sustainable, and like how did we get in this place of low capacity? So what we learned through that process of just like reflection was realizing that work was kind of distributed in a very informal way. We had this very informal structure where people were just kind of overcommitting throughout the years and making things happen because they thought it wouldn't happen if they didn't do it, and not necessarily because like it was a role that they actually wanted to fill. And then at a certain point, a lot of those people who were doing heavy lifting had life changes, like they had kids or they were just less available for whatever reason. And then all of a sudden, all those gaps stopped being filled and the organization started losing structure, but there was not really a clear explanation for why. And it produced like just all these bad dynamics. So it also produced a lot of burnout and made it harder for the organization to grow because not everyone wants to overcommit like that, right? It's not a sustainable organizing culture. And when you're overcommitting, you're also not opening up space for more people to step in and take leadership. So with those reflections in mind, we made a decision to rebuild the organization in a more sustainable way with more explicit structures. And we're now a lot more clear about the capacity in the organization that it actually takes to do things. And also clarify this is like a volunteer-led organization. So like it's hard, like we're all doing this like, you know, with full-time jobs and other commitments and just, yeah, I think we have only one one organizer who gets a stipend who's like our lead organizer, but everyone else is like completely volunteer. So at this point, we're very clear about, yeah, again, the capacity it takes to do things. And like we know if we want to launch a new committee or a new project, like we'll be very clear about like, okay, let's think through like what would it actually take to do that? And do we have what we need to do that? And if not, like if the request came from a member, we'll put it back on the members and say like, this is what we would probably need to do that. Like, is this something you're interested in taking leadership on? And if the answer is no, or it's not a good time and we still want to do it, then, you know, maybe we make a longer term plan to figure out like, how do we get to that place? But in terms of making a lot of those changes, a big thing that has helped make that feel sustainable is just like kind of checking in with each other on an ongoing basis and making sure we're not recreating that dynamic of like the work being draining or people doing things because they think they have to. And it's become a habit we've had to build. And at this point, we're pretty good in like at like checking in with each other. Like if someone volunteers for something and you know they already have on a lot on their plate, like people will be like, are you sure? Like, are you sure you want to do that? And it's been really helpful. But we've also had to just periodically reevaluate like how we're working together because as we grow, like we inevitably need to change like when we have new leaders involved, we have to change like our decision-making structure so that everyone has what they need and there's not bottlenecks and stuff. And that's been really interesting, but it's also required like that space for reflection and changing, like anticipating we need to evolve rather than just, you know, trying to do the same thing and it not working. And then otherwise, I think, yeah, other lessons have just been like the value of doing constituency-based organizing compared to issue-based organizing, which was how I was originally introduced to organizing. I think like when you start with a base of people, who are either directly impacted by something or care deeply because of who they are, or the community they're part of, or the work that they do. It can be very anchoring. Like, we don't have to reach very far to figure out like what messaging is going to resonate. Like, we just listen and ask people and talk to people, and it's great. It's awesome. I also think that when people do like issue-based organizing that's disconnected from a specific constituency, it can also be very limiting, because like people have a lot going on in their lives, and if you ask them to just focus on one specific thing, you might end up attracting people who are more privileged or have like really niche interests, like climate justice, for example. Like, a lot of people care about it, but who can make it their one thing, right? Probably not a lot of people. Versus like, yeah, I guess that's the end of that thought. And then finally, just, yeah, the final takeaway of like learnings from Hun is just like a deep level of appreciation for our lived experience members and their commitment to this fight over many years, especially when we're at that very low point where honestly we were considering like, should Hun even continue to exist as an organization? Like, there were a few very committed lived experience leaders who were just very clear about their commitment, that they would be ready, whenever other people were. And that was incredibly inspiring to me, that sense of resilience and persistence. And it's something that I've also thought a lot about, like, where does that come from to be so committed when you don't have what you need, you don't know if you're going to win, and like, where does that come from? And I really think that it's about honoring our commitment to each other and each other's dignity and humanity, and saying, like, this is so important to me, so I'm not going to give up on myself. And I know it's important to my community, so I'm not going to give up on my community. And I'm going to commit to keeping showing up because it matters that much. And I'm going to continue doing it, even if I don't see this become, my vision become a reality in my lifetime. Like, that is just very, very inspiring to me. So it sticks with me a lot.
Thank you so much, Belinda. Mafe, would you like to share some of your own experiences and lessons?
Yeah, so I work at the Workplace Justice Lab, and we focus on supporting economic justice organizations to expand and retain their membership. And somebody in the questions, I saw that I could talk about about defining a base. And so I think the base is like the constituency that the organization is choosing to organize. I think like what Belinda said, like, it's not around an issue. It's like I work with SAU 2015, like their base are caregivers, or I work with the Filipino Workers Center in California. Their base are Filipino caregivers. Like, they have even a smaller base because that's who they've decided is who they're organizing. And we actually have a tool. We have a 4-day training where we try to like just give practical tools for organizations on how to work on these things. And one of the things we talk about, it's like, it's really overwhelming to think of your whole base. It's like, organize your base. It's like, my base is really different. Some of them like are 10 years in my organization. Some are like only on a listserv and they've never shown up to anything. And so how you can't do one thing to involve those type of people. So we break your base off into 5 categories. That's we call it circles of commitment, but think about it as it's a big circle, and the middle is your core, which is your staff, where usually most of the resources, experience, and responsibilities lie. And then at the outer, the biggest circle are community targets. So like anybody that you've decided it's your base that could be interested. But you create 3 layers in between your core and the community targets, because usually what happens is that the core is responsible for everything and they get burnt out, but also they don't distribute responsibilities and leadership to other people, or you try to do it, but you do it to like a very enthusiastic volunteer that just joined yesterday. So it's like so we find that most organizations either focus mostly on their core or on the community targets through the like Instagram and email programs. And so I think somebody asked in the on the Q&A already, for example, it's like, we're already really good at organizing people that get us, but not people that don't understand this issue. What do we do? So what I would say is that you have to define each layer, and you already know I have a strong 20 people that really get the political education we're trying to do. I'm going to create a training for trainers for them so that they learn how to train others. And then you're helping them focus on your next layer of leadership for the folks that know, like, are maybe less that you want to get into the training, but you're not doing the training yourself. You're actually relying on leaders that could do it. So that's the type of pathways we help people create. So like think about the responsibilities and privileges of each level of your base. And it's easier to break it down by like commitment level. So like people that can give 2 to 5 hours every week, these are the type of responsibilities we give them. They like host house meetings, they pay dues, and they receive like weekly groceries, like a weekly grocery stipend. Like there's a benefit they get, but there's responsibilities they have, like running a training or running a house meeting. And then you have the next layer of people that can work 5 to 15 hours a week. Like that's probably like your super developed volunteers, and you have training programs just for them. So just like as a way to try to help take away the overwhelmness of what do I do with everyone in my organization, we recommend you section them off, and then I think you will identify where you're the strongest, and so you can choose to either beef that up so that you just need to teach that layer that their role is to support the next one, or choose the part of your base that's less invested on right now and start focusing on it. And my experience this tool we used in Cosecha. So the way I ended up helping start Cosecha, it's funny, Belinda, you bring like momentum taught me this, and then I learned this. So momentum taught me the importance of how mobilizations can really shift public perspective. The Dreamer movement that I was part of as undocumented youth, we used our stories. Maybe some of you that are watching this webinar remember listening to like Undocumented and Unafraid, and we didn't win legislation, but we won DACA, a permit that we can renew every 2 years. And we did that a lot through small teams, but through lots of mobilizations, really, and very high energy activists from universities, which is what I was. But then we couldn't win immigration reform. And so I wanted to build more power. And I remember talking to some organizing mentors when I was trying to implement this like momentum mass practice tactics. And they told me like, well, like research shows that people that are most likely to volunteer are young, educated folks. So focus on the college students. Like don't think about, like they were telling me like focus on the low hanging fruit. And I think that's a strategy, but I was really interested in building an organization for people like my parents, for undocumented workers that I thought, and a lot of us thought, like hadn't been given the room to lead in meetings. Like we would mobilize them, but they didn't have actually any say in the organization, and they're like, we want to be helpful, but they didn't feel like the leader of the movement. And so that's what we did in Cosecha. We decided like, this is our base, like older undocumented immigrant workers. It doesn't matter how hard it is, like that is who we're organizing, and created systems and trainings around that. And it was really hard, and it takes a long time. Cosecha was able to win driver's licenses in Massachusetts for undocumented immigrants. The first circle we created in Cosecha happened in 2016. And we won driver's licenses in 2022. So it took 6 years from like the beginning of our organizing in Massachusetts to a victory at that level. So also to remind us, the problem with funding, it's like we get 1 and 2 year grants. The right actually gives them like there's 10-year grant cycles that some of these organizations get. Like what could our organizations do if we knew we had 10 years to really develop our base and win? And so I think that's why also base building is hard. Like, it takes time. But and then the last thing I'll say from my personal experience is that teams are really important. Like the way to reach scale while focusing on your base, I think is teams. And we did that a lot in Cosecha. It wasn't like an organizer would support one leader. Like an organizer would support building a team. So like I would go to Salem, Massachusetts, or Lawrence, Massachusetts, and like we would drive to the cities out of Boston. So we have a Boston team, but then we would drive like 2 hours to the other cities to start their teams and help them like create their trainings. And I think it was that network that also the reason this feeds the rest of the organization is like the core, who are the organizers, sometimes we think we know better and we design the strategy for the organization, even though we had the best intentions to build a movement led by undocumented workers. We would still sometimes make strategy decisions at the center. And that happens a lot in our organizations when there's no clear voting structure with our membership. And we did not want to get into driver's licenses campaigns. Like Massachusetts has been losing this for 10 years. Like, we don't want to get back into this campaign. But the organizers, this happened in New Jersey first. The member leaders from those states, they're like, well, this is what we want to do. So we developed them so much around strategy and making their teams. They're like, fine, yeah, organizers don't want to do this. We're going to do it anyway. And so the organizers had to follow the leadership of our base. Otherwise, we didn't have one. And they were right. Then New Jersey won driver's licenses in 2019. Massachusetts won it in 2022. And the reason that happened is because the member leader said they wanted to work on that. It wasn't the organizers bringing that campaign in.
Thank you all so much. There's so many useful nuggets in these experiences that I think we can all take away in our organizing. As I'm listening to you all, something that's really resonating with me as a through line is kind of this essential lesson that the base itself is not a monolith. It's not just some big nebulous category. It's everybody who's not a revolutionary, and it's just the people, and they all want this one thing, and we just got to find a way to give them the tools to vote on it and empower them to organize, right? Like the base, our community is not only not a monolith in terms of capacity and commitment, some of these lessons that Mafe was just sharing, but also like Kamau and Belinda were bringing up, our base is also not monolithic ideologically. We might have to get out there in our communities and disagree, and we may be put in a position as organizers where we have to kind of take responsibility for stepping into that dynamic tension between the ideas that we're bringing to the community and what the community is asking for. It really made me think about some experiences that I had personally in my time in Northeast Syria with the Kurdish freedom movement, and how they really were grappling with this question, even in a revolutionary society. Like Kamau was saying, how do we learn from revolutionary movements? And I saw a place where the sort of structures of empowering the base directly to govern itself were there, but the results were wildly uneven depending on the nature of the particular community. So in places where people really had a strong sense of commitment to one another, a shared sense of identity and belonging, and political consciousness, those structures really just directly empowered self-governance. But in the places where that glue wasn't really there, it was ineffective, or rather, I think it was as effective as it could be, but it showed the limits. So I appreciate everything you're sharing, and I just wanted to share that as something that's resonating with me, because it strikes me that here in our own communities, something we're facing so much is the lack of that glue, the lack of community. We're in these really alienated contexts. So thinking about things like what Belinda was sharing about just grounding ourselves in what is it that really builds those bonds of shared commitment feels just such a precious lesson, as every bit as much as organizing strategy itself. So thank you all. I'd like to move us along here to the third and last question of the discussion, and kind of invite us to get a little real here and have kind of a critical reflection on the broader left and movement, the moment of the left that we find ourselves in. And to kind of kick that off, I would sort of throw out there that it seems certainly to me that we're in a moment of a failure of the left to build power, and that this conversation about base building is right at the center of that. So what I want to ask all of you is, why do you think base building is so often absent from social movement praxis today in this moment? And what can we do to make it more of an essential pillar to how we understand organizing itself? And let's kick it off again with Kamau.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the foremost question that we have to grapple with and continue to grapple with. I'll go back again to a little bit of history. for me, a huge thing that came out, particularly for Black organizing in the 60s and 70s, was the destruction of radical Black movements, the destruction of organizations like the Black Panther Party, the Republic of New Africa, SNCC at its most radical, other organizations like RAM. Basically, COINTELPRO, as a conduit through which the federal government operated, did everything to not only murder, imprison, disband, cause fights. And what it left us with in terms of the destruction of that powerful movement and those powerful ideas, what they left us with was nonprofits and voting. And so the avenues of change, which became the accepted avenues of change, was to vote in legislators, to do the quote unquote work for us, to be representatives for us, and that we would impact our community through social service work for the most part, a depoliticized way in which other organizations had used. And, a lot of the programs that even depoliticized folks use are also used by political people. The question becomes, if one has no politics when they're doing it, is it any longer revolutionary, right? It's like, I remember a famous story about SNCC in the freedom schools, and the person mentioned that teaching Marx in college is not revolutionary, but in SNCC, they taught it in the community, and that became a revolutionary threat for the government to try to destroy. So what happened for me, what I think happened in terms of the destruction of base building and community organizing, is that so many resources came into movements. And again, I trace a little lineage for the Black community through Jesse Jackson. I like to name names. Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton, Van Jones, who I think is a understudied, prominent figure in terms of moving left politics to the right and gaining favor with capitalist bosses, to elements of BLM, right, where literally hundreds of $1 millions poured into organizing. And again, I think people had some people acted in good faith. I think people thought that they were doing good work. I think people were serious, a lot of folks, about their organizing. I also think there was co-optation that took place, which is taken the place of base building organizing, is basically to become famous, an influencer, and to be connected to politicians, thinking that federal policy will win the day for our community needs. I think we're at the end of that cycle in a lot of ways, because I think it's shown itself to be particularly useless in terms of gaining long-term power for disinfected communities, right? Whether those communities be Black, Latino, LGBTQ, women, workers. We've seen that this mechanism of depending, quite frankly, on the Democratic Party to do the work of the left has been a complete and utter failure. And also, of course, as the Democrats have participated in overt genocide, we've seen that as sort of the local policies, the local within the United States, how empire has basically destroyed the left, whether Republican or Democrat, and internationally, how empire functions vis-a-vis either Republican or Democrat. So I think what's left for us is to go back to the things that, if we look at and study history, what are the things that the capitalist class fears most? What are the things that the political class fears most? They fear most an organized mass, an organized critical mass of people who are becoming studied and fighting for their rights on the ground. And again, if politicians come along and their rhetoric changes because of it, then that could be good. If famous people start to do songs that are radical in rhetoric, that's cool. If nonprofit foundations give more money, that's good sometimes. But what really matters in this scenario would be a critical mass of people continuing to organize, not just mobilize, but organizing not as a reactive state of, like, when, again, pointing to my community, when someone is killed by the cops, right? it's not bad to mobilize, but unless mobilizing turns into something that's long term, and then it's just mobilizing, and then unfortunately, in a not purposeful but weird sense, we're almost waiting around for the next trauma or to happen in our community to react. And as we've also seen recently, sometimes those traumas pile upon each other, and we don't even react to those, right? Because we never know which incidents will bring out mass mobilizations. But if we don't organize and not organizing with people, then we're not creating new community while at the same time fighting against those who are trying to destroy us. And I'll wrap with this part. The important part, people subscribe, they call it a couple of different things here, dual power, base building. I think dual power's had a meaning that's changed over the century, but we'll stick with the current meaning. Dual power, base building, or fight and build strategy, the things that we call it. The building part, we have to be careful not to maroon ourselves into thinking that if we build, that we win, because the structure will allow us to build as long as it doesn't feel threatened. But when it does feel threatened, it will attack those structures, whether they're liberated territory structures, intercommunal structures, whatever we want to call them. But those structures are still important because they give us a model of what resistance looks like. They also build power in communities to show how people can be proud that they built something that didn't have a lot of resources, but we're building it from scratch. We control it. It is something that people may fight for to keep it going and to maintain it. But we always have to remember that the build and fight, that those things to me are interlocked, and it's not one over the other. And I think that as we base build, those are the lessons that we have to learn. And again, at CMB, we've probably became well known because of our work on Cop City. Cop City, the only time Cop City, I think, engaged in successful mass base building, and this is controversial for what we did, was when we did part of a referendum, right? So there were other parts of the work that we did that were probably more activist organizer focused, whether or not that was direct action, or whether or not those were town halls, or whether or not those were marches and demonstrations. But the base building is in going where people were at. And again, I think this is controversial because there are people like me and others who prefer more militant tactics, or who like to think that we're doing more militant organizing or action. But it was the organizing people around having the right to vote, which got us over 100,000 signatures, right? And some of that is a good example of where we may be at in the United States. People have not broken away from the electoral system. But if we can prove that the electoral system does not bring the changes that they think it will by showing people, okay, you did everything that you were supposed to do. We collected more signatures than all the folks who voted in the last electoral mayoral election, and they still refused to put it on the ballot. So they tied it up in court. We can see that the system does not work for us. What else can we do? We can use those signatures to gather those folks into different structures like people's assemblies, people's coalitions, and/or campaigns. And we can do that with those folks, or try to do that with the folks who signed the petitions, because they now see that the electoral process did not work for them. And they now see through this period of time that we're in, that how the entire electoral political system is meant to save itself and not meant to build community. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kamau, for that kind of historical grounding. Mafe, I know that you have to leave us a little earlier tonight, so I think it'd be great if maybe you could share next, and then we go to Belinda. So feel free also to, give any sort of like broader reflections that you'd like to share with us before you have to go tonight.
Cool. Yeah, I agree with what Kamal said. I know Belinda's also want to touch the funding piece about why base building is hard, but I think I mentioned like the right has funding cycles that are 10 years long, 5 years long. I don't know of any organization in the, I mean, maybe if you know one that does, let me know, but I don't know anyone that has a funding cycle that's long. Like we're always battling 1 year. We're lucky if we get 2 years. I think the left has lost the practice of power building. I think partially is I think Obama and like that era, we were actually able to win things without having to rely on like mass base building. Like you were able to actually create change through lobbying elected officials, through just like a lot of political power wielded in DC by the left and nonprofits um, got us some victories that then I think started then I think slowly grassroots organizations started deprioritizing base building because some organizations were able to still win big things without a base. Funders funded that, and I think that left a big void for organizations that are more member led, that have dues. And I think like all of those practices, like I mentioned earlier, they just take more time. And I think all of us, like the left, just we need to know that that's okay, that we're like taking the time to build organizations that will like get us out of this moment stronger, even if we're like a little lost in the big strategies. Like we know we can focus on building connections and building teams locally from our base. I actually do I have any big reflections? No, I think I'll just, sorry, like, I don't have any big reflections now, but I'll pass it to Belinda. Or sorry, I'll pass it back to you, Arthur. That's all I have for that question.
No, thank you so much, Mafe, and thank you for being with us tonight. It was really a privilege to have you. But absolutely, let's bounce it to Belinda.
Awesome, yay. So I totally share Kamau's analysis that we never recovered from COINTELPRO, and that's where this come from. I got like so excited when you said that, because this was like something that I had offered in another space, and I was like, are people going to think this is like wacky? But like this is what I think it makes a lot of sense, and it's what I genuinely believe. And um, I think it's interesting because we've recovered from a lot of anti-left repression in the past in the United States. And I think we have to also remind ourselves that prior to those people power movements of the 70s, there was also the McCarthy era. So a lot of the organizers of that era also had to overcome that repression. So it's helpful to remind ourselves like we've done this before as a movement, and those people who were so inspired by from the Black Panthers and the Young Lords, like they actually had to overcome that themselves too. And I'm thinking specifically of an anecdote about Chacha Jimenez, where he describes in his early process of becoming politicized and switching the Young Lords from a gang into a political organization, he like showed up and was getting involved in like anti-gentrification work, and he met this woman who was a self-described communist, and he had a really negative reaction to this. And he was just like, no way, like I'm not gonna like eso es comunista, no, you know, from that Latin American place of anti-communism. Oh, it runs deep. But you know, he had to overcome that himself and question like what was up with my reaction, you know, like and ultimately came to, you know, embrace socialism through the Black Panthers. So it's interesting to think about that, because I do agree, like that's ultimately the root, but like we have overcome this in the past. So it's helpful to remember that resilience. And this particular time, I think it's taken us longer than usual because of, you know, this theme that we've been talking about, where our organizing work has been captured by the nonprofit industrial complex and foundation funded organizing. I have the same analysis around like it becoming very depoliticized, somehow organizing becoming depoliticized, but you know, like here we are. I think it's a lot of that like anti-left sentiment. So like it was safe to talk about climate change, but it wasn't safe to talk about decommodifying things or capitalism being the problem, or saying the word socialism or anarchism, or you know, many different left tendencies that we may be influenced by. And the long-term impact of this again is that yeah, a lot of foundation funded organizing encourages us to do this depoliticize issue-based stuff, right? Rather than the constituency focused things, which I think will, it's kind of inherently like people will just radicalize themselves if you get them to organize, you know, according to things that are actually impacting them. Like they're just gonna come to their own logical conclusions and realize like who is responsible for the conditions and things that they're dealing with. But yeah, I think this issue-based organizing that has been more dominant is just, it's inevitably alienating and incompatible with base building. Like if you're going to have people commit their time as volunteers, which is what you're dealing with if you're thinking of doing base building, like they're just not going to do it unless the work really speaks to their needs, and there's also opportunities to be engaged in the decision-making process. And when the work is foundation funded, all these, ideas for campaigns might come out of nowhere. And even if it's like, sure, theoretically, I agree with this thing, it just might feel like it's coming from nowhere and kind of out of left field, and might not feel like something that belongs to people enough that they actually want to participate in it. And when you're accountable to like your base instead of a funder, you also have the flexibility to like follow their needs and change priorities in a way that you can't really do if you're beholden to like a grant commitment or something like that that you absolutely have to deliver on. So in terms of making like what it would take to make base building an essential pillar of our organizing, I think we need to have a very clear understanding of some of the difficult realities that we're facing. Again, this is, a lot of us have mentioned this, but we're incredibly weak as the left right now, and that's because our organizations, never recovered from COINTELPRO. We've failed at building mass movements on the scale that we need. We just really have to grapple with that. And fortunately, I do think there's a lot of opportunities now, because like this isn't new. We've kind of known this for a long time, but it's been the thing that we've been able to put off and say like, "Ooh, I'm just doing the best that I can with, my nonprofit, whatever." Like I know it's not totally the right thing, but I'm doing the best, and at this point, like with where it's landed us, like we just can't do that anymore. And I think like that doesn't fly anymore. And I think there's a huge opportunity there, because we finally, just have to face up to the situation that we're in and how we got here. And I think that's a huge opportunity. And then what else? For the fundraising issue, I also think to get out of the cycle, like we can lean into fundraising through base building, right? And just make it as a part of our regular base building activities. So like labor unions and political parties raise like very large sums of money from small contributions. And like, why can't community organizations? Like, I think we can do it, right? Like it's not like unfathomable that we could like recreate something like that. And finally, I think leadership development is also going to be a really big part of making base building just, have a larger presence in our movements. There's a lot of organizers who are great at facilitating democratic decision-making processes and running democratic organizations, and there's also many people who might not have a lot of experience with it. So I think we need to share those skills so we can do this at a much larger scale. And also build cultures that allow us to actually try new things and learn from each other and make mistakes. I think a lot of us are afraid to make mistakes. And when it comes to base building in particular, that can feel extra scary, because you're going to make a mistake in a way where you're directly accountable to your community, right? And you're going to hear from people directly, and that can be scary to folks. So I think we need to have a culture that, really like supports us to like take risks and learn from each other. And just centering like, even if it's hard or it's scary or you don't know what you're doing, like just really grounding ourselves in like, we know this is what we need to do. So whatever's getting in the way of that, whether it's something very personal to you or specific to your context, like find a way to name it, like what's getting in the way of base building. If this is what you want to do and there's something in the way, like what is that? And get the support that you need to figure it out, right? Like maybe it's something in your head, or maybe it's something that's like really big and structural, like where your money comes from, but like we're never going to get there unless, you can start by naming like what's getting in the way and like start to address it. Maybe it's like something you can deal with right away, or maybe it's something like you have to chip away at, but like just find out what's blocking you and start to move closer to the work that you know is necessary.
Thank you all so much. These are really useful reflections. I think something that's coming to mind as you're talking to me, which is I think is less a root cause and more of a symptom, but nonetheless is worth mentioning, is like in my neighborhood work, something that's come up too is these days people are a lot less comfortable or familiar with people skills and building relationships and having face-to-face one-on-one conversations with ordinary people. You know, like talking to your neighbor for a lot of people is like terrifying. And if that, as long as that's true, like we can't build power. Like we just can't, you know? And I think there's something to be said about how certain forms of activism, again, we're not here to belittle like mobilization and direct action, and you know, a lot of us come out of that tradition, myself included. But you know, it does not require those kind of relationship building skills, people skills to, you know, show up and chain yourself to a thing and like scream a political slogan, right? That might be like a important strategic thing to do at a given moment, but that's not going to give you all of the tools to like go out in your community and make change in a way that actually builds lasting power. So it strikes me that part of it, almost like beyond the sort of like theoretical strategic side of like kind of defining what base building is, that there's also a need for us to just kind of like practice and learn and grow those just kind of basic human skills that we so often lacked in this moment of kind of isolation.
Can I say real quick,
Please,
just
please.
conversationally speaking, I think one of the biggest things for organizing training, because again, I think these are there's sometimes there's folks who may have some natural abilities or good conversationalists, and you can move that to organizing. But I sometimes think that folks forget that organizing is a muscle and a skill, and everybody doesn't have it at first. And even the folks who sometimes think they do have it, they may misapply it, or they may have too much of one skill and not enough of another, right? They can chat you up all day, but they can't remember to get your phone number and your name and to do the follow-up call and all the rest of it. But then I think the other thing that we always have to be wary of is, again, because sometimes it's the folks who are more politicized who are leading the way in trying to create the base building. And then because we have such defined politics, if someone doesn't match up or meet our politics, we are ready not to work with them anymore. And for me, base building in community is a struggle a lot of times around ideas, but also accepting the fact that you're going to think people have backward ideas that you're not going to like. It doesn't mean they get to be thrown away. It doesn't mean that they're terrible people. It just means that they don't know what you know today, which you didn't know yesterday, right? And so I think real organizers, folks who do more than, let's say, joining up with other folks who have similar political ideologies to do work together, but organizers who also think about how do I go back into particular communities or constituencies and mobilize those folks, have to always keep in mind that folks are not going to be where you're at, in your job. Again, as an organizer, at least part of your job is to try to bring people over, win people over, but do so at a rate that's acceptable for them, not for you.
Oh, can I respond? Because what Kamau is saying, there's a principle from we use the Circles of the Women from the Saddleback Church, and they have a term that's called Oikos principle, Oikos, which is just saying that the best new believers are the most effective evangelists because they still have lots of relationships with non-believers. So like Kamau, what you're saying, I think sometimes the most experienced organized, like the people that are the most have also been on the organization the longest. And then we all start just being friends with the organizers and stop losing touch with like normal people that aren't in organizations. And so like a reason to delegate responsibilities is like the best people to recruit new people to organizations are actually the most recent people we have because they still have the most relationships with the non-believers from the evangelical church framework.
I love that. That is so useful. Belinda, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I want to respond to the point you made, Arthur, about like lacking social skills and stuff. And that's another thing where it's like a challenge, but I also think it's an opportunity because like people are lonely. Like people are very lonely and isolated and they need to connect to people. And like this can't continue. Like it's just bad for everyone's mental health. And like unfortunately with that could come some lack of social skills, you know, like there's a lot of like doomerism, which like I feel like I find it personally challenging, especially when like people are blaming each other for things or being like, oh, we'll never be able to do this because you're like that or whatever. And it's just like, oh God, it just like it hurts so much because it's like even if you don't like this person, it's like it's not their fault. Like they're not Elon Musk, they're not Donald Trump, they're not like, the powerful people who like created this situation. Like they're just like a person who's like has some hot takes you don't like. And like and I just think, and the last thing that we need to do is like turn against each other, like we need to understand each other better. We need to find solidarity with each other and we need to organize each other and gather each other. Like if you don't think that person has a good take, like how are you going to gather them and like, politicize them and turn that around? Um, but yeah, I think about that a lot. The it's like, yeah, people have limited social skills, but there's also opportunity because people are isolated, they need to connect. And it's like that's not good for people's well-being. That just sounds like a depressing headspace to be in, to be like judgmental and thinking like nothing is possible. So like I think it can help overcome it if you think about it from that perspective of having empathy for like, dang, like sounds like this person is just like not very happy right now. And like maybe we can find a way to, change that or like, find a way for them to talk about like what they're really upset about.
I'm so glad you brought that up. That is so, so, so true. We need not be discouraged by that. It makes me think when myself and my kind of neighbor comrades started our community organization, we first went out thinking, okay, we gotta like explain to people why it's important that we like come together as neighbors and build community. And we started with like monthly barbecues in the park. But when we got out, as soon as we got out and started talking to people in the community instead of in our little circle, like over intellectualizing it, people were like, hell yeah, what should I bring? And those relationships started to form a base. So don't be discouraged. Like building community is what people do. And if you can build community, you can start to organize it as a base. Yeah. We're getting later in time, and we really wanted to make sure we have at least some time for interaction with folks that have questions. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up. People can write questions in the everybody chat here in Zoom. We'll give a moment for some to come through, and then we'll kind of take those that we have time for. But while we're waiting for folks to write their questions in the chat, Kamau and Belinda, do you have any other reflections kind of riffing on this notion of relationship building and base building?
I guess one thought I have to offer is like we've talked a lot about how hard this work is and like preparing for, maybe people to say things that are like off-putting or whatever, but I also want to emphasize like you'll be surprised like yes, people will be all over the place and you need to be prepared for like people to say stuff that you think is kind of wild or like or that like hurts your heart a little bit. But also you might come across stuff that's just really inspiring that will like probably make you cry because you're just like, oh my God, this person actually cares and like that's beautiful and like the things that people will tell you will like get in your head where it's like, who's organizing who? Like like people have said things that like really stick with me and I'm just like, damn, like I've been thinking about what this thing this lady said like the whole weekend and like things that won't even go away. So I just want to that really become part of you. So I just want to emphasize that like yes, it is hard work, but it's also like really gratifying work that feels great when you get it, done right. I think there's ways to do it in a sustainable way, like and there's a lot of tools. Like I relied a lot on a tool from Adrienne Murray Brown's emergent strategy on what is this? It's like literally stuck to my desk. The assessment of interdependence and decentralization. It's like a checklist of like questions like who do you lean on, who leans on you, are all of your needs met, if yes how, if not why. So like if you're feeling burnt out, like you could go through a checklist like that and try to figure out like what needs to shift. But yeah, the work, it can be hard, but ideally it should also be inspiring and gratifying and satisfying and beautiful and powerful and like and just yeah, awesome.
Really quickly, yeah, I want to second that notion. My most favorite organizing was in Jackson, Mississippi. A northerner, East Coaster, New Yorker, Brooklyn boy, went to Jackson to organize with people. And and whether I thought I was being arrogant or not, I thought I knew a lot, right? And so just to sit and organize with people and have people tell you their stories, their life, their understanding, their knowledge about how the world works, which is just very in tune with what your own political beliefs say, and they may not use your language, but they have their lifelong experiences. So the same way you've had yours, they've had theirs. And again, I completely agree with Belinda. The stories and the people that you meet. For me, a lot of the folks I met in Jackson who were the elders who had their own stories about struggle and history and things that they had to challenge them to face in terms of challenges. But still, this saying goes, still they rise, right? They knew who their friends were, their enemies, and again, they may not have used the language that I use, but they were clear on it. They wanted to build their community. They wanted to create infrastructure in their community. They wanted to create power in their community, and they did it in ways that was much more successful than anything I've ever done in terms of connecting to people through simple things like old age homes, through after school programs and other things. So I concur, like the joy and the resiliency and the ways in which people pour into communities without so-called, lefty people there like myself. It's beautiful to experience and be.
So true. I screwed up the question of where the questions actually live in the chat here. So we actually have a bunch of wonderful questions from people. So I'm just going to go ahead and start pulling them out. A couple that right away are sticking out to me that I want to throw at the two of you, actually both at once, and we can just popcorn. One of them is, how do we navigate the strengths and challenges or dangers of electoral politics as base building organizers? So any strategic lessons there? The second one is the question of reaching non-politicized people, but getting more into the how. So what are some effective methods that you've found in bringing non-politicized people or people with different ideas, different politics than ours along in the process of base building?
I'll go first this time, I guess. So I was going to say, because I think I saw the electoral question. So I am one of those folks who I think electoral politics does matter, because that is how, policy and resources get distributed. That is how control over police happen, control over institutions. But as a strong lefty, I think overindulgence in the American electoral system is a place where base building and organizing goes to die. So I think something like when we did the Jackson plan in Jackson, Mississippi, our approach was electoral. It was supposed to be base building, cooperative, so forth and so on. In my humble estimation, the electoral politics began to take an outsized role. And I think that was not good for the movement. And I think in general, again, that is where those who have power prefer for us to be, because I think they feel like they can knock us off easier. They can make us overly dependent on thinking that our liberation, our freedom, our power derives from every 2 years or 4 year cycles. And I think that's a huge mistake for us. So again, I think there are rules, or I mean, I think there's a role for electoral politics, but it is not the center for me of the work when it comes to base building. It is organizing a critical mass of people to figure out how to build institutions and how to fight for power. And some of that may come through electoral politics, but most of it will not.
Yeah, I guess my answer to that question would be that there just has to be a lot of work done to get to a point where the base is aligned enough, and you'll either know whether you have that alignment or if you don't. And I think it's something that you can start to build towards. So like within Hun, when we were doing kind of like strategic planning to figure out like our next campaign, we did a conjunctural analysis like in the style of Stuart Hall, where we like mapped out what are the short and long-term changes we're noticing in the economy, politically, culturally, et cetera. And we did talk about like politics and politicians, and it like our own analysis that bubbled up from our members was that neither the Democrats or Republicans really care about homeless people. That like Republicans tend to be more antagonistic, and that Democrats might like talk about it for points, kind of, but then never really commit to any actual action in terms of like actually helping people. So I think that helped a lot, that we have that shared analysis that came directly from our members. So you can find opportunities like that um, to like bring it out, and then kind of the collective knowledge of your base can be captured. And it can also just be a good way to like figure out like where people are at, because we arrived at that point, which like I think everyone agreed with, even though like not everyone would describe themselves like the same in terms of like political affiliation, or whether they lean left or right, but like everyone agreed with that statement. So that was kind of interesting. So I think, yeah, that kind of facilitation can help to understand where you're at and build alignment. um and like I personally would probably, I feel like it would only make sense to commit to something like that if it was like strongly felt across our base that like we had a clear collective understanding of like why it was worth it to commit resources to a fight like that. And like I wouldn't do it if we didn't have like that alignment. And I just don't think it would work. Like again, we're talking about like volunteers, like people just won't do it if it doesn't really resonate.
Really
Well,
quickly on the second part, you want me just to jump in? Some things I think that are overlooked. If you are new to a neighborhood or community and you're doing community organizing, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I am one of these folks who believes that organizers can be trained, and with the right training, folks can go into various communities and learn how to organize. So I know there's some ideas that say you have to be from a particular community or place so you don't know it. I dispute that for the most part. I think obviously it gives you some advantages, but it doesn't mean that organizers can't come from various places and organize. So with that said, I think part of a good strategy or some beginning strategies for folks to actually get deep in community is find out about community centers, what's happening at these community centers, when action is happening, when meetings are happening, what about the neighborhood association, who attends that. Some of those folks who are attending those kind of meetings are folks who are already somewhat involved. They are somewhat interested in ideas of community uplift, even if they don't mirror your ideas. So those are good places to begin having flyers that you can talk to people with either before or after the meeting, announcing something at those kind of meetings. Those things I think help get you started. And so when you're ready to call a town hall meeting, of course, having something with food is always useful in terms of trying to get people to come and sit with you for a while. I still think the idea of not necessarily just door knocking, but stopping people as they're going, knowing that there will be short conversations, having an elevator pitch of like what it is you want to speak to them about, what are the points that you want to make, inviting them to something, getting their contact information to do the follow-up. These are basics, understanding that the rate of success is relatively low in terms of how many people you have to talk to compared to how many people actually will come out to something. But again, if you're an organizer, you understand that already. You don't take any personal offense. You don't get mad. You don't get rude. When people want to leave, you let them leave. But if they engage you, you try to engage them and see if it makes sense to try to invite them to things. I think for me, those are some of the basics. Whether or not you also believe in starting programs sometimes. So again, finding out what community folks are saying they need and or want, and having programs where folks can bring young people to can also be a way in which you start to endear yourself to folks, and they get to see you and they make it a regular basis. Have these practices for a few months. Don't just expect a few months may mean at least 6 months, to be honest. Don't expect to walk into a community and be welcomed with open arms, but understand it's a process, it's a practice. Your first meeting may have 3 people, 5 people, 8 people, but maybe your third or fourth meeting may have 20 people or 30 people who are there to hear what the work is that the organization is asking people to join in on. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, y'all. We're getting to time, but I want to throw out just one more round of questions because there's so many great ones. And for those that put a question in the chat we didn't have time to get to, we apologize. There's no way to get to everything, but we really appreciate people's engagement in this conversation. One of the questions is about door knocking. Is door knocking essential to base building, and what advice do you have for the practice of door knocking? Right, so that's a nice straightforward one. Another one, and y'all could choose, is the question of what somebody called the urban geography itself. So maybe as a broader question, like how does the space itself of our communities, the infrastructure, the layout of our communities influence our strategies or the limitations of our strategies in base building? Stack is open, as they say.
Could you repeat the second question? I'm so sorry. My brain is starting to like.
Yeah, no, you're probably taking notes. The second question is about space, urban geography, and layout. So how does the actual layout of our communities, the constraints of the architecture or the geography influence the kind of landscape in which we're organizing and therefore like our strategy?
Sure. So I could jump in for this one. For door knocking, I don't think Hun is quite in a place where we're not at door knocking yet. We're still like trying to build our membership base. And like that's like our next tier of expansion is like people who don't come to our meetings, which is when we would start door knocking. But I'm thinking of like some door knocking I did in Baltimore for like this community land trust project. That was kind of how I originally got involved with Hun. And I was just very surprised that like people were very receptive to it because like I think we had a concern that people would be very NIMBY because it was like a community land trust that would be focused on housing like like people who would otherwise be homeless basically who are in like the lower like 30% like area median income. And like we anticipated all this like NIMBYism, and like what we actually got was like people like just responding really positively to it and being like, that's great. Like, yes, they were like very on board. So I think that's just like something that I would offer is like to kind of check your fears about like what kind of stuff you might anticipate. Like you never really know until you just go out there, and like what you can do is just like say like just be really earnest. Like don't, if you try to strategize around like preparing for the NIMBY thing, you might present yourself in a way that's like insecure or like with a chip on your shoulder or something. But if you lead with like your actual belief in the work and stuff, like you're going to open yourself more to those responses of like, yay, that's awesome. So I would just say like don't let your fears like be realities. Like you never know what people are going to say until like let them actually tell you. Don't try to make an assumption. Like really go into it open and trying to learn and hoping for the best response. And then with urban space, what I think about mostly is like it's a constant opportunity for us in our organization to do like political education on the ways that like urban space is like shifted to be hostile to folks who are homeless. And it's very interesting because it's like this is where like a lot of our lived experience members will shine because they know this history. Like I was tabling at there's this like organizer fair that like DSA hosted in November, and I was tabling with one of our lived experience members, James, and he gave a speech, and he was pointing out during the speech like all the different things in the park. Like there used to be this here, and there used to be that, and it was removed, and those fences were put up across the street to prevent people from sleeping on these steps. So it's just very interesting how like if you can connect with people who have that sense of history of the environment and how it's changed in ways that are very political, you could use that for just ongoing political education. But you have to find people who have that knowledge that comes from years, of like living in a place.
I will add really quickly on the question of geography, just as a real world thing that we did. When we decided a CMB was created, one of the first things we got was a donation of a house. And some of them said they would purchase a house for us. We had to pick the neighborhood. And that got us to have some of the young people we were working with tell us what neighborhoods would be the best suited. And we had criteria for us. We were saying, as I mentioned earlier, working class, poor, underserved, Black community wanted something walkable because we thought, based on our limited resources, it would be easier for us to reach people if the communities had sidewalks so that we could walk from house to house to house, and there were row houses. So for us as an organization that was, again, made up of folks who were already, quote unquote, politicized, and we saw this as sort of radical work that we were doing to organize within community, what were the ways in which we, with our limited resources, could best impact a community, and what would be the best communities to pick? And so we measure geography as a way for us to choose what would be the best place for us to sort of settle into. And we wanted to make sure, even with the community house, that we use it as a place to have meetings and to do work out of that was in the community where we were doing organizing. So no downtown office. We wanted to be in the actual neighborhood that we were working with. And then lastly, I think, what was the second question? It was on
Door knocking.
door knocking. I found the most successful door knocking for us was when we were offering some folks something for in exchange for talking to us, whether or not that was a gift certificate. Sometimes part of the work that we do is to pay folks a limited amount, but pay folks when rent, mortgage, and/or utility bills to help support them in staying with the community. So the money we get from the nonprofit sector, we pour it back into the community to say, if this helps you stay, and if you want to talk about why it's important for us to work together and to do more of this, come out, and then we can have larger conversations about the work to change some of that stuff. But I found with door knocking to get a slightly higher rate. Sometimes having things that help support folks was a way of getting people to listen to you more and to actually take in what you're saying and be responsive.
Well, Kamau, Belinda, Mafe had to leave, but thank you, Mafe, anyway. I just really want to give a heartfelt thank you again to all of you for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and wrap up the conversation. We went a little bit over, but I'm glad that we did. I wish we could go like 3 hours. So really appreciate not just you coming today, but all the amazing work that you're doing. Encourage folks to check out organizations like Community Movement Builders and Housing Our Neighbors, to show them some love, to learn more about the work that they're doing. Also, if you're interested in showing the Solidarity Research Center some love, you can look at the links in the chat. But most importantly, we want you to just keep continuing to be a part of this conversation. We hope that it empowers and encourages you to go out to do the organizing yourself in your own community. We hope to kind of demystify this. It's like Kamau was saying, like, we can learn these skills. It's not rocket science. You're not born a rock star community organizer. It just takes practice and it takes strategy. So thank you all for attending. Thank you all for speaking. Really want to encourage folks to check out the rest of the Municipalist Learning Series. That link is also available in the chat here. You'll see places where you can sign up to RSVP for our upcoming events in both September and December. Also, some of the questions that we didn't have a chance to get to, folks will find, I think, some really useful answers in our Building Power in Place toolkit. That link is also in the chat. So really encourage folks to check that out. But without going on and on and on, love and solidarity, stay dangerous, get out there and build power. And we'll see you around for the next one. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Peace.